Thank you very much. Now, if we just go to the next slide. What I want to talk about today is the way in which I think COVID-19 has significantly changed the agenda around the creative economy and the creative industries. And in particular, what I want to suggest to you is that one of the big impacts of COVID has been the rapid rise of the digital sectors and the crisis of the creative sectors. And I think this has generated an imbalance that could well have longer term costs for the development of what we could call a digital creative economy. But if we think first of all about the impact of digital technologies on creative industries around the world, obviously the many transformations to the production and distribution of digital content, of which I think three are particularly worth noting: the emergence of the new digital-only industries and providers, the extent to which digital platforms operate as the amplifiers of digital content and of traditional media content. A good example of that is the relationship between Twitter and television, for instance, or Twitter and journalism, and the extent to which platforms have become competitors to traditional media and creative industries, which I will say more about. Next slide. And UNCTAD, in its creative economy report, noted that the creative and digital worlds have a long history of interacting with one another, that creative content interlaces with and gives visual life to the digital world. And I think this continues to be the case now, as it has long been. And their report identifies a series of opportunities for the creative sectors around big data, augmented reality, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, blockchain, and so on. Next slide. Okay, and these include the ways in which artificial intelligence is changing value chains for creative content from start to finish, with both positive and negative impacts. Obviously, questions of disinformation, filter bubbles, deep fakes also arise, but also the very interesting extent to which data and algorithmic sorting are transforming the sort of programming that we find available to us. And this is particularly the case if we think about something like the Netflix algorithm and the way in which the Netflix algorithm identifies content that it anticipates would be suitable to us in the ways in which that were pioneered by Amazon with retailing. That augmented and virtual reality can transform storytelling and the ways that content is experienced, but business incentives may not fully align here with individual well-being. The creative economy and the platform economy are converging, but this is posing difficult governance issues, and in particular, many of those around where digital advertising revenues are going and the general lack of accountability of the platforms for the marketplaces where they dominate digital advertising. And possibly the least developed of these is blockchain, that it holds considerable promise for the creative economy, but requires further development. There are important IP implications potentially of blockchain and the capacity for disintermediation that many have talked about. Next slide. At the same time, we have to acknowledge a history of suspicion and mutual incomprehension between these sectors, that many in the arts would see the digital sectors as the enemy and see the world in terms of a polarization or a binary divide between, if you like, the arts and humanities on the one side and science and technology of the other. Creative industries have long had a history of engaging with the digital sector primarily around questions of copyright infringement. On the digital side, the tendency to see content as free and not requiring nurturing or attribution is there. The extent to which these companies have historically thought of themselves as tech companies, or as the head of UK public policy at Google put it, a consumer-facing engineering company rather than a creative company. Mark Zuckerberg emphasized to the US Congress that Facebook was a tech company, not a media company. And Campbell Brown, again from Facebook, in meeting the news industry representatives in Australia, made the point, we are not here to save you. Next slide. Okay, so there's a series of digital drivers of change going on, but there's also counter tendencies. And I imagine as we go into 2021 and beyond, we will see some of this. We'll see the demand for authentic experiences in the digital world, what has been referred to as the Glastonbury effect after the popular UK festival, that people want to be seen at events in order to have a kind of communal experience. We wait to see if that returns in 2021, noting also that the internet is now increasingly visual. In Australia, the Digital Platforms Inquiry released by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission made some very important findings with regards to trends in advertising, noting that digital advertising is now 50% of all Australian advertising, that from about 10% 10 years ago. And within that, Google and Facebook account for 80% of Australian digital advertising. And the ACCC drew attention, among other things, to the difficulties experienced in tracking information related to that, since there is very little capacity for third-party verification of claims. Next slide. Some of the sectors, I want to now turn particularly to the impact of the pandemic. And in Australia, I think the impact of the pandemic has been paradoxical. Australia has been among the countries less affected by the COVID pandemic, although it has had very serious lockdown strategies applied, differentiated on a state-by-state basis. So what we've seen is a general rapid growth in entertainment to the home. So we can see here, this is from PricewaterhouseCoopers Entertainment and Media Outlook, that the growth trends in subscription video on demand are accelerating very quickly, that it's moved from being worth about 500 million in 2016 to 1,500 million in 2020, and the high growth trajectory there sees it being worth as much as 4 billion by 2025, and about 70% of Australian homes now access some or other form of subscription video on demand service. Next slide. We've had rapid growth also in the interactive games sector, and we could break this up into some subcategories within games, such as esports and online gambling, which have grown rapidly over this period, but again, quite an acceleration in growth in interactive games and esports. Next slide. At the same time, we see broadcasting in transition. That I think one of the important things to note is that when we talk about the digital economy, we're not just talking about the born digital companies, but the extent to which traditional media and creative industries have themselves become digitized. And you can see here the slow decline of the linear television market, but this doesn't necessarily mean the collapse of conventional broadcasters, since there is a significant growth in the broadcast video on demand market. There's something of a segmentation or a bifurcation going on within the traditional broadcasters, and these include the public service broadcasters, around the degree to which they are providers of traditional broadcasting services, but also linear broadcasting services, but also increasingly their entertainment is driven by their platform-based activity. And I think we're still at a stage of understanding what this bifurcation of traditional broadcasting and public service broadcasting means in terms of their content. But it is fair to say that the public service broadcasters increasingly view their world as not just one where they coexist with the commercial broadcasters, but where they coexist with the platform-based subscription video on demand services. Next slide. To indicate a sector that's been particularly hard hit by COVID, this is music, and you can see there a very sharp decline in the music market 2019 to 2020, and an especially sharp decline in live music. So as with all performance-based sectors, they were very hard hit by the impact of COVID. Next slide. Okay, drawing on the OECD's study of COVID in the culture and creative sectors, that creative industries were among those most affected by COVID-19, along with tourism and travel. And the whole set of challenges associated with social distancing have been critical here. The likely downsizing of the creative sectors in the absence of public support in the early stage of the COVID pandemic in Australia, the JobKeeper scheme proved to be an effective, if very expensive way of keeping people notionally in work, or at least getting paid in periods where the organisations they worked for had virtually ceased to operate. But over time, that's been phased out. And what it's revealed is the considerable structural fragility of these sectors and their dependence upon a floating population of individuals, non-profits and small firms, many of whom found it hard to access schemes such as JobKeeper because they're not traditional workers, they're not on the payroll on a regular basis. Next slide. There have been some positive responses. So the turn to digital distribution of content has been a pervasive feature. Creative sectors producing a home-based product or service have done well, streaming media, games, social media. There have been some crossovers identified with health and education. So there's been growing attention to the importance of the arts for mental well-being. There's been a geographical shift in Australia that I think is at its early stages, but a turn from major cities to smaller cities and regions, which may be good for addressing one of the challenges of the creative sectors of being their tendency to overly concentrate in the major metropolitan centres. And we may see, and we are seeing actually, a significant growth in the regional creative sectors. Next slide. You can see here from this study by BOP Consulting, the ways in which different creative industries have had different types of impact. So in Australia, it's been a boom time for film and television production. And this has been in part because of the difficulties of shooting in the US, saw a large number of productions relocate to Australia. And we sometimes talk about Aussiewood, where productions that are essentially US content are being shot in regions of Australia. So Netflix's Young Rock, about the early life of Dwayne Johnson, was designed to make the Gold Coast, Brisbane areas look like Hawaii. There's a bit of this sort of production going on. So different sectors have the different capacities to work from home and to adapt to physical distancing. But we can see in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide the extent to which COVID has had a major impact on the performance industries and the heritage industries, and a generally negative impact on the visual arts sectors. Next slide. So just thinking about some of the issues of concern, I think we've been in a transition that, whereas in the late 2010s, we were talking about the dynamism of the creative economy and the creative industries. And one example would be the manner in which the UK identified a creative industries sector deal, where it positioned the creative industries as one of the core pillar industries of the UK economy. And we had similar developments in China, for instance. Creative industries were identified as a pillar industry. But I think there's been a dissipation of energies here as the sectors are increasingly understood around the creative arts, and this has increasingly become an agenda of survival. And I think one of the areas where the most lasting impacts may be experienced is in higher education, where there have been moves, and certainly this occurred in Australia, to defund the creative arts and the humanities in order to shift student demand towards the science and technology sectors. This sense in which the digital economy and digital economy strategies are disconnected from creative industries and creative economy strategies, a loss of policy focus on the creative industries, so a degree of fragmentation of the arts and digital sectors. And finally, of course, the recurring issue of economic polarization, that there's no question that many of the big winners of COVID-19 have been the largest tech companies, which experienced enormous growth in their revenue base over 2020, 21, and the extent to which this accelerates platform power that is economic, political, and communicative in its nature, and creates a greater degree of dependency of the creative sectors on these tech giants. And my argument here would be that I think it's timely to look at some degree of policy rebalancing to empower the creative sectors in their dealings with the digital tech giants. Thank you.